Hi, I'm Harvey Havel. I am the author of several books, and my work in progress um, is a novel called Charlie Zero's Last Ditch Attempt, which should take a few years to come out. But I thought I'd read an excerpt from that. It's about a young, sort of lonely guy who gets involved in sort of the underworld of the drug narcotic underworld. And so this is an excerpt from a most recent chapter that I've written, and I hope you like it. That the nights that followed were long and lonely, as there was little he could do to avoid being alone. And while it had proved to be a tough challenge when he had drunk himself silly and had the luxury of the prostitutes beside him, that same challenge that he thought he could work his way through without forces higher than himself getting involved in what he originally thought to be a very common and innocuous crime. This challenge of loneliness now seemed less threatening, since he was no longer in charge of his own life. He could no longer control, or at least try to control, whatever fate dealt him. It scared him a bit, that sense of not being in charge anymore, not having that self-drive, self-will, and self-determination to attract the things and the people he wanted in his life. He remembered how one of his old high school teachers had said that there are those who let things happen and those who actually make things happen, letting things happen being the less favorable of the two. But to give up one's will to determine one's own life simply involved letting things happen for a change, and trusting instead in the forces and the people and the events that he couldn't possibly see, the mysteries of the things that he couldn't for the life of him map out beforehand or predict with any certainty. He didn't know what his life was about anymore, because while being incarcerated, he had lost its definition. And if his identity had been stripped, in this place was left this very light and formless person who didn't know if he should stand up or sit down in the cool comfort of his living room. The lights were dimmed and the refrigerator was empty. The process of being in jail didn't so much as scar him as it did release him. Living through the ordeal became the scalpel that cut away the pains of continually wanting someone to accompany him through an existence that was always devoid of something, as though he were as light as air, his weight no longer confined to gravity. This feeling that he was the same person but not the same person at all, that he was a part of his world but at the same time totally aloof from it. While sitting on his sofa in the darkness, he even thought he were some kind of ghost, or at least a floating entity that could have been blown away if the wind so took him there, or if these forces that he couldn't name or see sent him one way or maybe another. It was so very silent in his apartment, yet so very strange, as though he were the only person on earth, as if the other tenants in his building had mysteriously vanished, and all that was left were the shrill of the nighttime insects and the temporary swoosh of cars passing along the avenue down below. Perhaps he wandered between the lands of the living and the dead, but did not know it yet, as there was no handbook or guidebook or map to show him where he should go next or what to pursue. And if it involved any self-will on his part, or any sort of elaborate plan that utilized his own mind, it would surely lead to the same misery and pain that being jailed for a week provided. It was more the case that some piece of the puzzle that would have otherwise completed him had been moved or misplaced. Even though he sat in the darkness, lost in thought, he wasn't exactly so alone. Surely there was a physical need to touch someone in the darkness, or at least exchange a few words with anyone within earshot. But again, he no longer had control over who would end up passing through his life, or if a woman would magically drop from the sky. The obsession over women lifted, but left a stillness and an emptiness in its place that drove him to his bed without any reason, without really feeling tired or sleepy, but just lying there immersed in the strange, awkward feeling that nothing would ever become of his life, unless other spiritual forces decided to give a life to him, or at least spark some tremendous idea that would get him working towards something, but a thing that would never manifest. He could no longer foresee or predict what hid behind corners. The rudimentary laws of cause and effect leading to predictable results no longer applied. Neither would chance or probabilities explain anything either. He somehow had to trust the wind that carried him. He would no longer calculate how that wind worked or directed him. He figured that there were those who simply lived on the wind and followed the currents and the breezes that pushed and pulled them through the endlessness of time until there is no permanence at all, just temporary rest and then movement all over again. It was a schedule he couldn't know but only could trust somehow. It was like taking his first steps with all the fascination, awkwardness, and timidity that accompanied a changing consciousness and cleansed perceptions that had once been so firmly rooted in his desires, but were now no longer there. And as he looked through his bedroom window to the alleyway below, a view that permitted the same view of the avenue where a few twilight revelers walked home arm in arm and laughed amongst themselves, it seemed as though joy had been placed at their feet like a gift from a god that favored them. He really wondered how much longer it would take for his intense desires to lift. He wanted these desires gone, as though a doctor could take a magnet and pull these desires up like shards of metal. Just one swoop and his desires for these women would all be vacuumed up. All of those images and photographs and pixels and films and frames that he had pounded into himself, all gone. Perhaps it was way too late for these desires to be pulled like spools of spaghetti, a hand that tugged out the soft, diseased tendrils of desire that had warped him so thoroughly. But he knew better than to think that some miracle would put a stop to his miseries. The sad irony about it was that love was supposed to be the panacea that ended his suffering and pain. But he suddenly realized that love itself and its reckless pursuit had made him suffer more than the total absence of it. He had little clue that love was also like its ugly twin, war, and that multitudes died more of love's twisted ability to carve up a man's heart than any sharp bayonet that some unreasonable enemy thrusts into him. But there were other types of love, he figured, and not necessarily of the love that demanded the taste of a woman's lips or her charms in his bed. And at that terrible hour of staring out the window, he saw the shadows of women gliding down below. The lampposts illumined their shapes and sizes, their curves, their hair that bounced along their necklines, and certainly there was the urge to reach out and grab one of them, his imaginings doing somersaults in his line of vision. But he understood that it was the desire, that plain, simple, and torturous urge to feel her skin upon his, the gentle brushes of his fingers upon her wrists, and the skin of his legs entwined in hers, that needed to be purged. Desire could no longer sustain him. It brought him to his knees in the cruelty that a more spiritual world demanded of him, as though a part of him had been ripe for conquest, not by any woman, but by forces he could neither see nor define, as though his entire body and mind were instead a part of some incalculable order that he had little choice but to come to terms with. And no, he didn't go willingly. It seemed as though he had fought it for years and years with tooth and nails flying about this way and that. It was the worst kind of abuse, but he knew he had to give up. It was like a red-hot poker that jabbed into his most loving centers, purifying desires so relentless that they would have surely killed him if he continued. And in their place remained the vapid air that hung without any sympathy or remorse, without any righteous praise or compliment, just this heavy air that takes silence as its partner, an air so empty that his weak body could only stand listless, as though the slow death of maturity had finally found him. It gave birth to a darkness that drowned the room, the appliances in the kitchen dead and obsolete, the furniture layered with dust, and he had many hours to go before morning. He hoped the sunlight would at least make him forget all about it, forget that he ever desired a woman in the first place. He crawled into bed and buried his head beneath the pillows in an effort to dream of something that didn't involve anything he knew or remembered. Thank you very much.